Well, look, thank you very much for inviting me onto this. I sorry I don't come to more of these things, but uh, life is complicated and so on. But it's a wonderful series of talks. And I've never really had to do a retrospective before, so I don't quite know how to go about it. But I was trying to think back about the different stages of Herodotus in context. And I think my most vivid recollection is real excitement. um, much of the fundamental work was done in Washington. I got a fellowship at the Hellenic Center, and I thought I knew what I was going to do. I put in a proposal, and when I was there, it started morphing into something rather different. And I was starting off, I think, with ideas about sort of scientific method and the pursuit of the barbarian. I was going to do a lot on the archaeology, new archaeological discoveries or old archaeological discoveries, which could perhaps be put into more dialogue with Herodotus. But with this amazing expanse of time that you get when you're in the Hellenic Center, I was just able to read voraciously in the pre-Socratics, sophists, above all medical writers, and work on the medical writers. And I do remember vividly thinking I'd had a really, really busy job. It was extraordinarily difficult at Royal Holloway. And I arrived there absolutely exhausted. And in the first 3 weeks, I realized I'd kind of done my wish list. The wish list that I'd had on my desk for about the last 6 months had been done. And so there's a sudden kind of massive amount of time. And so that's one thing. And I also already had a very strong inkling of connections um, between Herodotus and uh, some medical work, physiologoi, and so on, and as Donald Latiner and others had already done. But the world of medical research in Greece was sort of opening up massively and very in very exciting ways. And I did spend a lot of time reading and reading and reading in both medical works and work on Greek medicine, and being very excited and very inspired by, as it were, discovering this other world where there was so many connections with what I already knew or what we already knew, but from new angles, in new contexts, and in new forms. And once you start reading the early Hippocratic works, you then confront the fact that these texts, some of them virtually purely physiological, philosophical, theoretical. That is, some are purely sophistic in the worst sense, others are sophistic in a better sense. Others had very strong empirical elements, and you just have this huge range. Um, and the fascinating combination of observation and theory, and all that very suggestive. And so anyone who's ever had to grapple with the problems in Herodotus, where you think he's claiming autopsy, but how on earth does he get from A to B? How on earth is he managing to say this about that? Um, so that was very thought provoking, and the way that making you think about the way sometimes what you might observe or what you might think you observe is influenced by the theories, and what you think you should be observing was very thought provoking and stimulating. And so there was a lot on that. I did a lot of work on that, and with all this expanse of time. And then that raised the issue of the physiologoi and the sophists and the medical connections, and the way that they all interlock in an extraordinarily interesting but very complicated way. And so at some point, I think probably after Washington, I realized I had to try and work out how on earth I thought what I thought a sophist meant, what a physiologos meant, how do they all relate? And were we thinking of a cultural intellectual milieu in which everything was mixed? They're all doing much the same sort of thing, or are they actually separating groups out? So were we thinking of a cultural intellectual milieu of simply people pursuing historiae, or were some groups trying to forge their own identity and their own methods? And as Geoffrey Lloyd showed of doctors, there was very much a sense in some of the doctors, the medical works, of trying to separate themselves from the philosophers. And so that, as it were, gave you a kind of two for the price of one. That was really also very useful, because you could see the urge to separate out when actually the similarities were very, very clear. And sometimes people are more keen to separate out at their techne, when in fact they know full well that what they're doing is very similar to what other groups are doing. But one of the most satisfying things I do remember was how more and more slotted into place. I think we've all had the experience when you're trying to try out a theory and it's not really working, and you're getting more and more desperate, and the arguments are getting more elaborate, because you know it's not really working. And I have very strong recollection of how I just found more and more elements or cases of very great interest, which made sense suddenly. It made sense to me, at least, that yes, this is where Herodotus is interacting. He's coming at this from this point of view because this is what is already there out there, as it is a hinterland of either medical interest or people who are kind of doing ethnography for medical reasons or that sort of thing. So, for instance, Scythia, the way that we all know that the histories have an enormous amount on Scythia and an enormous amount on Egypt. And it was very exciting and provocative to think, well, yes, actually, those two places are already really important, or simultaneously at the same time they are important to people asking slightly different questions of about Scythia and about Egypt, or about health and Libya and so on. And so yes, as I went on reading, I was finding more and more. I felt I didn't need to engage in special pleading. I was reading about medical theory, or I was reading something about this or that, and recalling a little bit in Herodotus. And it was really helpful while I was at Washington, 94 to 5, that there were 4 philosophers at the Hellenic Center. So they were very helpful sort of interlocutors, and I could try things out on them and check that I hadn't massively misunderstood some kind of philosophical argument. And I think actually perhaps this is helpful to admit for people just starting on research, if there's anyone here doing that. One very strong impression from at least the Washington year, and actually later on when I came back to the UK, people were very skeptical. Really skeptical. So when I sort of said what I was doing, and everyone would say, "Oh, what are you doing in Washington? What are you doing now?" "Oh, I'm writing a book on Herodotus and medicine and sophists." And there was sort of sometimes a polite silence, or once people realized instantly, yes, there's something there. But quite a lot of people looked really skeptical, and sometimes quite pitying. Others looked really politely amazed that I was doing something so stupid and so implausible and so unlikely, as if to sort of think, "Oh, poor thing, she's gone off off the deep end," and that actually really was a thing. I mean, it happened so often that people just looked utterly politely skeptical, as, "Oh dear, yeah, that won't work." And that was quite helpful to make one realize that actually it needed time, and I needed to really show from the texts quite extensively that there were indeed sort of patterns of expression, and there were connections, and there were other patterns of material that were very thought-provoking. So I think it's perhaps encourage people who are starting off on research, that sometimes you're doing something that people have never thought about it. I mean, of course, people in this company probably had thought about it, but other people haven't thought about it. Think it's implausible. Look politely skeptical. Be certain. Try, just make sure it works. Make sure it works, and then be confident. So I also had long discussions with colleagues about the importance of sort of traces of discourse, different clusters of material and argument and language. And that was really helpful, talking to philosophers and talking to scholars of the philosophy of language, thinking and finding that there were certain kinds of, the thing that's quite prominent in the book is that he goes into certain modes of discourse for certain topics. So the Nile, the most prominent one, all the material about the Nile and the arguments about the Nile, where he goes into quite elaborate, well, fairly elaborate philosophical proof. So not just critiquing predecessors and contemporaries, but really going for the solid, really extensive proof. And that kind of alerts you to the way that actually he needs to do that. He needs to do that because no one's going to believe him. And here we are, he's going into his really argumentative mode. The clusters of fancy new terminology, fancy argument, really up to the minute discourse, which would put him instantly into the sort of the proto-scientific group of writers. So that was quite that was very exciting, and also really helpful to have lots of people to talk to about that. And then it pushes you to notice where else, whenever Herodotus is really argumentative and gives you proof and argument and extensive reasoning, he's almost always doing something, or perhaps always doing something quite controversial. He's arguing against a hidden bunch of people, and that kind of made sense. That suddenly made sense to me, and so it became clear that you couldn't pin down one or other group in such an extraordinary period of meshing together these various areas of activity, all of which were interlocking with each other. Yes, there was proof in rhetoric, which is very similar to proof in some of the worst sophistic arguments, the most notorious sophistic arguments, are also similar in early medical work, but with variations between authors. And the discovery, for me, of the range of early medical texts was particularly exciting and particularly useful because they were varied, they were complex, they had different techniques, and above all, they weren't mediated by the hostility of Plato. So the frustrating thing for anyone who ever tries to think about the sophists, so-called, I'm using the sophists meaning the people conventionally called sophists, though I know there's lots of blurred lines like Protagoras and Gorgias, is that we have to deal with so much of Plato, which is so hostile, and they're in fragments and out of context and so on. And so this was another really interesting way in, where at least you had whole text. You actually have whole texts, and you can see the entirety of the argument rather than two lines of a quotation. And incidentally, I'm sure there's a lot more to do with Democritus if one can make sense of the massive fragments. And I know that, Scarlett Kingsley's recent book has done something more with Democritus, and maybe there'll be more to be discovered of Democritus, or people can make more sense of what's already out there. I'm sure there's quite a lot more to say there. And so yes, and I used my notebook system for the first time, which had a page per topic or a page per problem. And I started off my notebook, and some of the things that I thought I was going to have an awful lot to say about, I had nothing to say. And then I found other pages went on and on to several pages. So that was also a sort of great kind of step forward there. So what else? I've got some funny observations about the title. Herodotus in Context. It has a subtitle. I wanted to call it something like Before History. I wanted to get Historiae into the title to grasp the nature of the multi-generic nature of Historiae, inquiry, proto-science, etc., etc. But CUP flatly refused. Michael Sharp said, look, you just can't do that. It's just going to get miscatalogued all over the world. It'll be put in prehistory, It'll get lost. We just can't have that. So that's why I settle for the rather anodyne Herodotus in context. And of course, that leads to some points of omission, rationale. What would I, what did I leave out? What should I have not done more on? I mean, reviewers noted, of course, context which hadn't been considered. So tragedy, Athens, a lot of Athens, political ideology. And of course, the title, to some extent, the title is to blame. But the subtitle is really what the content was. But perhaps I should have made the sidestepping of tragedy. I think I thought that tragic influences were possible, but other people would deal with them much better than me. I've dealt with them, but they possibly overplayed. And because we're dependent anyway on a very few fragments of tragedy and have to look very hard and go fragments again and again. For instance, the tragedy about Gyges, don't know very much about it. And I also thought, well, if you're looking at structures of thought and morality, the tragic punishments of hubris and excess, I thought that was a fundamental feature of Greek thought and Greek morality and culture from Homer onwards, that it would be very difficult to pin down, well, this is tragedy as opposed to a much wider pattern of Greek thought. Also, the political context, political ideas and the histories. I should have a bit more about that. I mean, the book wasn't to imply that this wasn't central as well, to concentrate on the things I thought I had something new to say, rather, and where something important, new conclusions which could be drawn as sort of new ways of looking at things and new angles, rather than going over the same passages which other people could look at better. But I did at least hope that, or I think I might have hoped that once you've got a discussion of Herodotus' affinity with proto-science, the art of persuasion, the sophistic period, much more firmly into the second half of the 5th century, one would be therefore able to encourage to go back and read other bits of Herodotus or the grand scheme of things slightly differently. So could kind of go back to the Persian debate in Book 3, where there's technical vocabulary, debates, Hellenism and freedom through the last books, or indeed not just the last books, but particularly the last books. The fact that he says early on, relatively early on, that Pausanias, the Spartan regent, wanted to marry is it Megabates' daughter, and become tyrant of Greece. And then at the very end, he doesn't mention that, and he just treats Pausanias as the Spartan regent, who is the austere Spartan. And so Pausanias ends up on, as it were, a high note at the very end of Book 9, but he knew perfectly well and had indeed already mentioned it, that Pausanias wanted to become tyrant of Greece. But that's for another work. Looking forward to, well, of course, that's what Thucydides then comes along and does. And I think Michael Flower and John Marincola pointed that out in the commentary, that basically, Pausanias is left on, is allowed to leave on a relatively high note as the observer of Spartan austerity and the virtue of Greek poverty, as opposed to Persian overabundance. Yes, and above all, I suppose one could say an awful lot more about the clear intimations, particularly at the end, of the coming of the Athenian arche. One of my very favourite lines is right at almost the very end, the last paragraph, but 9, 121, where you have Xanthippus and the Athenians and the inhabitants of Elios, and they've just crucified Artaectes, the governor of Sestos, and they stoned his son to death before his eyes. That's 9, 120. and then they sail back to Greece. And he says, and it's a very short paragraph, 1:9, 1:21, kai katato etos tutor, uda neti pleon tuton egenator. Nothing further happened this year. And it's wonderfully laconic. And I just checked a couple of translations. I mean, the Waterfield translation has nothing further happened for the remainder of the year, which I think slightly perhaps misses the point. Rawlinson, and that was all. This was all that took place that year. He's saying, and nothing further happened that year, as opposed, in other words, implying, that year, nothing further happened, but we all know what happened the year after, or something really major happened the year after. It's a sort of wonderfully pregnant, it's just there. And of course, we can read this as an intimation that great changes can happen, and as probably everyone we're all aware. I mean, Sestos was such an important place for the Athenian Maritime League. Xanthippus, he never explains who Xanthippus is, but Xanthippus is the father of Pericles. He didn't bother to explain, leaving some of his readers to notice, perhaps a lot of his readers not to notice, I don't know. And so I was sort of hoping that, thinking of the greater sophistication of Herodotus' methods and modes of argument elsewhere, where you can really say quite a lot and you can see connections and you can do a lot. And the alert awareness of his rhetorical technique, now also examined by Zali's book and Chris Pelling's recent book, perhaps all those kind of enable one, and I should have perhaps said more about this, enable one all the more readily to go back and have a look at the other bits of the narrative with a greater degree of acuity and political antennae. I mean, I hope it's possible. But then the frustrating thing, I mean, how much more interesting to hear it read aloud. If one heard that sentence read aloud, it could have an enormous amount more meaning. And that was all that happened that year, as opposed to, that was all that happened that year. That's not something Herodotus does very often, as far as I can remember. Just finishing off a year like that. Anyway, I mean, so others have examined his narrative technique so much better than I could possibly. I just want to leave that to them. Jacobi, I wish I had brought out more emphatically, spelt out more clearly that if Herodotus in context is even slightly persuasive, it fatally undermines Jacobi's old idea that Herodotus began as a geographer and then became a historian. Because after all, the sophistication of method and the combative argumentation and the extraordinary ambitious and combative and controversial theories about the gods in Egypt, which a lot of people here have thought about so much, that's all in book 2. Book 2, a wonderful resource for all aspects of Herodotus' thought and method. There's no way he started on book 2 and thought, no, sorry, he started thinking, I'm going to write about Egypt. And didn't think about Egypt in terms of the ideas about health and continence and medicine and how to argue a difficult case and the nature of the gods and the nature of the Greek knowledge about the remote past and so on and so on. All those things are really, I think, really relatively high-level questions, which fit so much better with a Herodotus who is more situated in the second half of the 5th century than someone who's following on Hecataeus, as far as one, and just sort of doing what Hecataeus is and then elaborating. And of course, he could have revised and so on. But it seems to me it's a treatment of the geography and the ethnography to give it a kind of a quick label. which, though it all has in antecedents, was also completely implicated in the new ideas about the oikoumene and the wider range and interactions of Greeks with non-Greeks. Not that that hadn't happened, of course that's happened before, and there's a long history of that, but the thinking about them in a certain way, with really very sophisticated questions, seems to be Herodotian, and seems to be a part of this exciting period of experimentation. So yes, I wish I'd said a little bit more about that. And then there's so much more to say, but I think I might actually add in a little bit more, that just a little personal note. When I was doing my degree at Oxford, the tutors had this extraordinary idea that they should let students loose on book 2 of Herodotus, and so I was in this very enviable position of knowing a little bit more than my tutors about Herodotus book 2, because they had just come on the syllabus, and it was just one of those books that you had to read as part of, I can't remember what, general text, I think, as part of grades, I can't remember. Anyway, I went to town with it, and I made the library by Alan Lloyd's commentary, and it was quite enabling and quite encouraging, because it was a sort of new area, and there was a new commentary. And that a lot of things that lingered, a lot of things lingered from that, and I always recommend anyone doing work, research on this period to spend a lot of time with Herodotus book 2. So I suppose feel, to end up with 1 or 2 questions. Yes, what's still amazing is how the narrative. There's the political narrative, the military narrative, but also the folktale-like narrative. How on earth that fits, cheek by jowl, with the more what I call sophisticated, sort of proto-scientific argumentation, and the modus tollens argument about the Nile and things like that. How on earth those all fit together is still seems amazing, and how he can move from one mode of discourse, the very, very leisurely, very old-fashioned, very oral narrative of the Croesus story, the Solon story, then to something else. And there is a sort of slight separateness of this other mode. And then finally, I wish there was more evidence and more material to work on, where stories and customs about other people, supposedly true, might be worked up or elaborated or even invented completely. And I have a sort of sneaking suspicion that there's quite a lot of that lurking behind Herodotus's text, or actually in Herodotus' text. If we think of the mythos that Protagoras is urged to make up in Protagoras's in Plato's Protagoras, where they say, well, do you want a mythos or a logos? And Protagoras says, well, be much more entertaining to give you a mythos. And he then proceeds to make up a story. I slightly wonder if some of those, I still wonder if some of those very suggestive ethnographic statements about various tribes in Libya, or various peoples in like the Massagetæ, have somehow been sifted through a sieve of what I can call it a kind of shorthand sort of political theory. A sort of political theorists thinking about ideal constitutions or dystopias or utopias, whether or not some of those got made up, or elaborated, let's say, politely elaborated and turned into something quite different, because they are so Greek. And one of my favorites, as some of you will know, is the Babylonian marriage market, which I didn't think it quite got into the Herodotus book, but the Babylonian marriage market, where people are separated out in an auction so that the very beautiful women are sort of auctioned off, and the money that someone's prepared to give in order to marry them then goes to dowries for the less the more challenged and frankly ugly people, it's a really sophisticated evening out of attributes, natural attributes, and other attributes. And I had a conversation with one of my colleagues who's a political theorist, who said, "Well, that's actually really fascinating because it's always really hard when in distributive justice to redistribute natural advantages." And this sounds like a very sophisticated political theory to me, has no relation to anything that's going on in Babylon, but it's really interesting that there it is, alongside the marketplace cure. And so one suspect, you can't really put this in print, but that Babylon was somehow a kind of a case study in which people just attributed things to Babylon that were much more part of Greek political theory than anything else. Yes, Tales of Other Peoples, a really rich place to do your utopias, or your political thought experiments, or your political theory. And that's why hinterland, the hinterland of all this is so important, it's so fascinating. I just hope we get some more evidence with which we can work. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.